After a winter rain, limestone walls stand open to a gray sky. No roof, no glass in the windows. The nave of a church that fire took 2 summers ago, its floor charred black, frozen weeds growing where the altar rail had been. Wind moves through the lancet arches with a low sound that is not quite moaning and not quite silence. The stone sweats cold. A woman drags a cast iron stove across the threshold, a boy pressed close behind her. She sets it in a side room where half a ceiling remains. She feeds it charred wood. For 11 minutes, the room holds something close to warmth. Then the wind finds its way in and strips it clean. On the blackened wall beside her, someone has scratched a mark at a child's height. Below it, a pile of wood too small to last a week. Tolef Brecka died on the 14th of November, 1864, when a loaded cordwood wagon slid sideways on frozen ruts and rolled him under the rear axle. He had been hauling for an army contractor named Phelps, who paid $1.60 per cord delivered to the Garrison Depot 12 miles south. Tolef had cut and stacked 9 cords. He delivered 7 before the road killed him. Phelps refused to pay for the final 2. He told Marte Brecka through the door of his freight office that her husband had broken the team, spooked the lead horse, cost more than he earned. He said this while sorting invoices. He did not look at her. He said she could take it up with the county if she liked, but he had witnesses that the accident was Tolef's own negligence, and if she wanted to press the matter, she would need a lawyer she could not afford for a sum that would not feed her son through Christmas. Marte stood in the doorway with Jonas pressed against her hip. The boy was 7. He had lost 4 pounds during an autumn fever and had not gained them back. His coat was a cut-down wool remnant from his father's work jacket, and it hung past his wrists like a punishment. She had $9.60, a cracked cast-iron box stove with a warped door that would not seal, 1 quilt, 2 iron pots, 1 missing its handle, a handsaw with 3 teeth gone, a half bushel of cornmeal, a small bundle of dried herbs Tolef's mother had packed for them before the crossing, now mostly dust. The ferry road was sheathed in ice. She had no horse. She had no fare for the eastbound coach. She had no relative expecting her within 500 miles. Jonas could not walk 12 miles in sleet, and she could not carry him and the stove and the meal and the quilt and the saw. The Briquet cabin lease had died with Tolef, and the notice was already posted. A man named Warren Pike had seen to that before the funeral mud was dry. There was one structure in the Salt River timber belt that nobody had bothered to lock. The church had burned 2 summers earlier. Lightning struck the steeple during a July thunderstorm, and the fire ate the roof, the pews, the pine floor, and every scrap of fabric inside. What remained was a limestone shell, roughly 38 feet long and 22 feet wide, with walls still rising 12 to 14 feet where the mortar had held. The roof was gone. The floor was charred planking over mud. The lancet windows gaped without glass. One side room, the old vestry, kept part of a timber ceiling, but the gaps between blackened boards let rain through like a sieve. Marte arrived with Jonas on the back of a neighbor's cart. The neighbor did not stay. She unloaded the stove, the meal, the quilt, the pots, the saw, and the bundle of dead herbs. She stood in the nave and looked up through where the roof had been. The sky was the color of a bruise, and sleet ticked against limestone like fingernails on a coffin lid. Jonas pressed one palm against the blackened wall. The stone was warmer than the air. That was the only kind thing the ruin offered. She dragged the stove into the vestry and fitted the pipe through a gap in the ceiling boards. She fed it the driest scraps of charred pew wood she could find. The fire caught, and for 11 minutes the vestry held something close to warmth. Then wind funneled through the nave, poured over the vestry's half wall, and stripped the heat out faster than the stove could make it. The candle she had set on an overturned stone bucket bent sideways and guttered. Smoke backed into the room. Jonas coughed until his ribs showed through his shirt. She stuffed rags into the worst gaps. She hung the quilt across the vestry opening. The wind found every seam, every loose edge, every place where fabric met stone without a seal. By midnight, the quilt had torn loose twice, and the stove had consumed a quarter of her gathered deadfall. She sat with Jonas wrapped against her chest and did the arithmetic that frontier women learned to do in the dark. The deadfall she had stacked amounted to less than 3/4 cord. The vestry was roughly 10 feet by 8. Even if she could somehow seal every crack, a stove this size burning through 3/4 cord would last perhaps 9 days at careful rationing. Winter in northeastern Missouri ran from late November through March. She needed to survive 120 nights. She had fuel for 9. That was the math. 9 days of fire against 4 months of cold. Deputy Amos Vale arrived on the 3rd morning. He was a young man with a long jaw and a habit of removing his hat indoors, even when indoors was a roofless church. He had been sent by the trustees to post notice. The notice said that no person should lodge within the ruin after sundown, on account of the danger of falling stone and the liability of the congregation. Vale unfolded the paper, but the ink had run from sleet. He stood in the nave with his boots on charred wood and looked at the vestry where Marte had hung the quilt and where Jonas sat on the stove's warm side eating cornmeal mush from an iron pot. He could not make himself read the final line aloud. Marte said, "Read it or leave it. Either way, I need to gather wood before noon." Vale left the notice wedged under a stone near the entrance. He told her the Reverend would come himself. He said it like a warning, but his eyes moved to Jonas and stayed there. And when he left, he walked the long way around the nave so he would not have to pass the boy again. Reverend Asa Whitcomb arrived the following afternoon. He was 61 years old, a former circuit preacher who had ridden the Salt River settlements for 2 decades before the war thinned his congregations. He was not a cruel man. He was a man who believed in arithmetic. He walked the ruin with the posture of someone inspecting damage he already knew was fatal. He touched the walls. He kicked at the charred floor. He looked up through the absent roof at clouds that promised snow. Then he came to the vestry and stood in the opening and spoke to Marty the way a doctor speaks to a family when the news is already decided. "A stove that size might hold heat in a 10 by 12 room with a ceiling," Whitcomb said. "This is 800 square feet under God's open weather. You have no ceiling. You have no floor worth the name. You have walls that drink heat like sand drinks water." Marte said nothing. She was sorting kindling by dryness, her fingers cracked and dark with soot. "You would need 6 cords minimum to heat even this vestry through January," Whitcomb continued. 6 cords of seasoned hardwood, split and stacked. And that assumes you could seal this room, which you cannot, because half your ceiling is open sky. How much wood do you have?" "Less than 3/4 cord," Marte said. Whitcomb closed his eyes briefly, the way a man does when the numbers confirm what he feared. "Mrs. Brecka, I am not here to be unkind. I am here because if you stay in this structure, you and your son will die in it. The county has a placement for dependent children. Jonas could be sent to. Jonas stays with me. Then you must leave this place, find a family to board with, find work that includes lodging. I can write letters." "To whom?" "I have no kin here. I have no reference except a dead man's name and a contractor who says I owe him for a broken horse team." Whitcomb looked at the stove, at the quilt nailed across the vestry mouth, at the boy eating cold mush with a wooden spoon. He looked at the 3/4 cord of crooked deadfall stacked against the wall. "Stone drinks heat," he said quietly. "Wind strips it. Smoke needs draft. And a roofless nave is not a house. I will pray for you, but I cannot endorse what you are doing here." He left. The wind that followed him through the nave entrance tore the quilt loose for the 3rd time that day. Marte rehung it. Her hands were shaking, and not from cold. The Reverend's numbers were right. She had done the same arithmetic in the dark and arrived at the same answer. The vestry could not be sealed. The stove could not be fed. The church was 800 square feet of open air pretending to be shelter. and every cord of wood she burned was a cord that vanished into sky. She could hear Whitcomb's voice in her own head because his doubts were hers. 6 cords. She had 3/4. Even if she spent every daylight hour cutting, she could not fell, buck, split, and stack 6 cords alone before the first killing cold. The saw was missing teeth. The timber was a 1/4 mile away. Jonas could not help, and even if she could find the wood, the heat would still rise through the open roof and disappear. The problem was not fuel. The problem was that there was no room to keep the heat inside. The idea did not come as inspiration, it came as failure. On the 5th night, Marte tried hanging quilts and scrap canvas across the vestry ceiling gaps to trap rising heat. The fabric caught smoke and sagged with condensation. One piece dropped onto the stovepipe and scorched brown before she pulled it clear. Smoke filled the vestry. Jonas choked and pressed a scrap of oilcloth over a broken window slit to shield his face. The candle beside him steadied. Marte saw it. The flame had been guttering in every draft since they arrived, bending and snapping with each gust that found its way through stone. Now, with the oilcloth pressed flat against the opening, the flame stood straight. She did not move. The recognition was physical, a tightness in her chest that was not cold and not fear. Her father's freight shed on the Ohio River. She was 9 years old, standing beside him while he inspected cracks in the wall of a building that stored cargo waiting for the ferry. Winter wind cut through gaps in the oak boards. Her father, a ferry caulker who spent his life sealing holes against water, held a tallow candle near each crack. Where the flame bent sideways, invisible air poured through. Where the flame held still, the board was tight. He pressed wet paper over a crack and said, "Stop the draft first, then count your fuel." She had not thought of it in years, but standing in the vestry with smoke burning her eyes and Jonas pressing oilcloth against a window, the memory arrived whole. Her father's thumb, blackened with pitch, the warm smell of tallow, the rough oak boards under her palm, the winter light through the chinks, and the simple truth he had taught her without calling it a lesson: heat escapes through moving air faster than through solid cold. The church was not impossible because it was too large. It was impossible because the warm air rose straight into open sky. The stove was not too small. The room was too open. The problem was not fire. The problem was air. If she could stop the air from leaving, the stove she already had might be enough. But she could not roof the church. She had no timber, no nails, no help, no time. She could not seal the vestry ceiling because the gaps were too wide and the boards too rotten. She could not build walls inside walls. She sat with this for 2 days. She gathered deadfall. She fed Jonas. She kept the stove burning at the lowest rate she could manage and watched her fuel pile shrink. On the 7th day, she walked the old military road east of the church looking for standing dead trees she could reach with her broken saw. She found the balloon instead. Crows rose from a tangle in the brush 60 yards off the road. Dirty silk, matted with leaves and ice. Rope. Netting. A broken wicker basket crushed on one side. The wreckage was half buried in undergrowth, and from 10 paces it looked like a collapsed tent some army detail had abandoned. But the fabric was wrong for canvas. It was lighter, finer, and it had a strange stiffness where it folded, a sheen that was not cotton and not wool. Marte pulled a panel free and held it up. The silk was heavy with oil and varnish. It smelled of rubber, old smoke, and rain. Where the coating was intact, the fabric was nearly airtight. She held it against the wind the way Jonas had held the oilcloth against the window. The silk did not breathe. The wind hit it and stopped. She did not understand balloons. She had seen drawings in a newspaper once, and Tolliff had mentioned the army using them for watching battles, but the mechanics of flight meant nothing to her. What she understood was canvas, caulking, and drafts. She understood that her father sealed boat hulls to keep water out, and that the same principle could keep air in, The realization formed in her hands, not her head. She was holding a material large enough and tight enough to trap air. If she could not roof the church, she could make a room inside the church. Not a room of boards, a room of sealed air, a warm air bladder suspended from the walls with the stove underneath. The silk would hang inverted, mouth down, above the stove. Warm air would rise through the mouth and swell the collapsed envelope outward. The stone walls would block wind. The silk dome would trap heat around the living space. The stove would not need to warm 800 square feet of open sky. It would need to warm only the volume the silk could hold. She stood in frozen brush with varnished silk in her bleeding hands and felt the arithmetic shift. Not 6 chords, not even 3. If the chamber was small enough, if the silk held, if the stove could heat the trapped air faster than the silk leaked it, she might survive on what she could gather. She dragged the first panel back to the church. It took her 4 trips over 2 days to haul the bulk of the silk, the netting, and the usable rope. The basket she left. The silk, spread across the nave floor, covered more than 200 square yards. It was torn in several places. Old seams had separated. Mice had chewed one corner. But most panels were intact, and where the varnish held, the fabric was as tight as a drumskin. Jonas watched her lay it out. He asked if she was making a tent. She said she was making a room that could hold its breath. Randy Moen found her the next morning. Randy was 38, widowed 2 years, raising 4 children in a board house 2 miles south. She was practical the way a woman is practical when sentiment has been beaten out of her by seasons. She came because she had heard from the neighbor who delivered Marte that the Norwegian widow was still alive in the church ruin, and she came with a kettle of bean broth and a set jaw that said she expected to find a body. Instead, she found Marte on her knees in the nave, sorting silk panels by condition, while Jonas held a lantern. Randy set down the broth and looked at the silk for a long time. "Blankets keep a body warm," Randy said. "You could cut this into bedding for 6 families." "And then it would be bedding," Marte said, "and the church would still have no roof." "Hanging it above you keeps nobody warm." Marte did not argue. She took a torn panel the size of a flour sack and held it against the wind coming through the nearest window. The silk sealed flat. The draft stopped. Then she lifted a candle under a small pocket of silk she had stitched closed with twine that morning. The pocket puffed. The silk rose 3 inches, 4, 6, swelling like a lung. Randy watched. Her mouth thinned. "That is a pocket," Randy said. "This church is not a pocket." "Not yet," Marte said. Randy left the broth and took her kettle back. She did not say she would return. She did not say the idea was foolish. She said nothing, which from Randy Moen was as close to an open mind as Marty could expect. But cutting the silk into blankets would have given Jonas warm bedding tonight. Keeping it whole meant gambling days of labor, days of calories she could not replace, on an experiment that had never been tried. If the silk tore under its own weight, if the stove set it alight, if the smoke pooled and poisoned them, she would have wasted the only large airtight material she would ever find. And Jonas would be colder for the delay. The risk was everything she had against everything she might build. She chose to build. The town heard about the balloon before it saw it. At Kessler's store, where men gathered around the iron stove to trade news and judgment, the word arrived through a timber cutter who had passed the church and seen Marte hauling silk through the nave entrance. He described it with the puzzled contempt that frontier men reserved for behavior they could not classify. She was dragging hundreds of yards of dirty fabric instead of cutting firewood. She was knotting rope instead of splitting logs. She had a child who needed food and warmth, and she was sewing circus cloth. The phrase that stuck was not the timber cutter's. It came from the livery owner's bench where Warren Pike sat with his ledger and his quiet appetite for other people's failure. Pike was 46, square-built, with the patience of a man who understood that debt was more reliable than labor. He bought distressed claims and delinquent notes. He had already acquired the Brecca cabin lease and Tollef's remaining tools through the contractor Phelps, who owed him for stable fees. If Marte failed, when Marte failed, whatever she had left would settle against the obligation Pike had purchased. Pike told the men at Kessler's that Marte Brecca was trying to fly the church to heaven. The laughter carried. Children dared one another to touch the sky rag. Women whispered that Jonas should be taken somewhere sensible before the widow's grief turned dangerous. A farmer's wife told Randy Moen that it was unkind to let a woman waste her last strength on madness instead of steering her toward the placement board. Pike arrived at the church on the second day of silk sorting. Marte and Jonas were untangling netting in the nave, their breath visible in the gray light that poured through the absent roof. Pike stood in the entrance with his hands in his coat pockets and studied the scene the way he studied a property before making an offer. "You cannot eat silk, Mrs. Brecky," Pike said. "You cannot burn it long enough to matter. Sell it to me for wagon covering, and I will give you flour." Marte kept working. "How much flour?" 20 pounds. She looked at the hundreds of yards of fabric spread across the nave, at the netting, at the rope, at the only material between her son and the sky. "You priced my winter at 20 pounds, she said. Pike's expression did not change. He was a man who had learned that patience and negotiation looked like kindness if you held your face still long enough. "I'm trying to help you. That silk is military salvage. Technically, it belongs to the government. If I wanted to, I could petition the trustees to have you removed and the materials seized. Instead, I am offering flour." "Then petition," Marte said. "And when the county sends a man to carry 200 yards of silk through mud, you can explain to him why you wanted it for wagon covers." Pike left. But the threat was not idle. He told Reverend Whitcomb that allowing Marte to remain made the trustees liable when she died in the ruin. He told Deputy Vale that the silk was stolen property. He told the men at Kessler's that any help offered to the widow was charity wasted on a woman too stubborn to accept sense. Randy Moen heard all of this. She heard it because women in small settlements hear everything that men say when they believe they are speaking only to one another. She did not believe in the balloon. She had said so. But Pike's hunger was a different animal than Marte's risk. Marte was gambling on an idea. Pike was waiting for a body. Randy brought flour sacks to the church the next morning. She said they were for patching. She did not say whose side she was on. The real work began when Marte accepted that she could not do it alone. She had spent 3 days sorting silk, untangling netting, and identifying tiers. The largest tier ran nearly 4 feet along a seam where the varnish had cracked and the thread had rotted. 2 smaller tiers punctured individual panels. The netting was in better condition than the silk, heavy cotton cord that had been waxed against weather, but it was tangled into a mass that took Jonas and Marte an entire afternoon to spread and straighten. The first problem was weight. The silk, stiff with varnish and heavy with absorbed moisture, weighed more than Marte could lift overhead. The netting added to it. Hanging the entire assembly from the wall, hooks, and window arches, the only anchor points the stone offered, required rigging she did not know how to build. She could sew. She could patch. She could seal a draft with caulk and cloth the way her father had taught her. But the engineering of suspension, how to distribute 100 pounds of wet silk across anchor points without tearing the fabric or pulling the hooks from the mortar, was beyond anything she had done. She tried on the 4th day. She knotted rope to a wall hook that had once held a sconce, threaded the rope through the netting, and pulled. The silk rose 2 feet before the hook shifted in the mortar. Limestone dust rained down. The rope slipped. The silk collapsed in a heap that buried Jonas's lantern and cracked the glass. That night she sat by the stove and counted what she had left. Less than half a cord of deadfall. 9 days had become 5. The temperature had dropped twice in the last week, and the wind now carried a smell that Tolef had once described as iron, the smell of real cold coming. She could not hang the silk alone. She could not cut enough wood alone. She could not keep the stove fed and do the rigging and patch the tiers and care for Jonas. The arithmetic of solitary survival was failing the same way Whitcomb had predicted, except not because the idea was wrong, because one body was not enough. Barbro Stensland arrived on the 9th day. She came because Randy Moen had told her, half laughing over a wash kettle, that a Norwegian widow was trying to sew the sky inside a burned church. Randy meant it as gossip. Barbro heard it as a technical problem. Barbro was 58. She had a limp from a dock accident in Memphis that had shattered something in her left ankle and healed it crooked. Her fingers were thickened by decades of pushing needles through river canvas, tarpaulins, awnings, cargo covers, boiler shrouds, and anything else that needed to hold against wind and water on the Mississippi packet boats. She had worked the trade as a sailmaker's assistant and wartime repair hand. She knew tension the way a carpenter knows grain, by feel, by sound, by the way a material complained before it failed. She lived with a nephew 2 miles north of town and did not often leave his property because the limp made walking an argument with her own bones. She stood in the nave entrance and took a long time looking, the silk on the floor, the tangled rigging, the collapsed test hanging from a loosened wall hook, the cracked lantern glass, the woman kneeling in soot with split fingertips, and a child huddled by a stove that was losing its war with the wind. Barbro's eyes moved the way a riverman's eyes move over a damaged hull, not with pity, but with inventory. Barbro did not offer help. She asked a question. "How do you mean to carry the strain across a torn panel?" Marte looked up. She pointed to the netting cords. "The silk should not bear all the pull. The net carries the weight. The silk just fills the shape." Barbro was quiet for a moment. Then she walked, limped, to the nearest panel and crouched with effort that cost her something visible. She ran her thumb along a varnished seam. She smelled it. She pressed the fabric between her palms and felt forgive. "Who taught you that the load belongs to the rope, not the cloth?" Barbro asked. "Nobody taught me that. It seemed obvious." "It is obvious. It is also the first thing a sailmaker learns, and most people never learn it at all." She stood up, and the standing cost her too. She looked at the absent roof, at the anchor points, at the stovepipe angled through the vestry ceiling. "I will need a chair," Barbro said, "and you will need to listen when I tell you that your patches are too small." Tell us in the comments, have you ever been doubted by someone who did not understand what you were building? That first afternoon, Barbro did not touch the rigging. She sat on an overturned stone block and made Marte bring her every torn panel, every frayed rope, every damaged section of netting. She examined each one with the unhurried precision of a woman who had spent 40 years knowing that a failed seam in a river storm killed people. Her first lesson was blunt. Marty had been patching tiers with pieces cut barely larger than the damage, sewn tight against the silk. Barbro pulled one patch, and it tore free with a sound like ripping paper. "A tier 8 inches long gets a patch 2 feet wide," Barbro said. "Stitched all around with waxed thread, sealed with whatever varnish you can scrape from the folded seams, and warm near the stove. The patch is not covering the tear. It is becoming the new fabric. If you are ashamed of how large it looks, you are not making it large enough. Marte listened. She unpicked her earlier patches and started again. By evening, she had repatched one major tier with a flour sack-backed panel nearly 2 feet square, stitched with linen thread Barbaro had brought in her apron pocket and sealed with varnish scrapings softened in a tin cup near the stove. The patch was ugly. It held. Barbaro would not leave until dark. When she stood, her limp was worse, and she leaned on the wall for 3 breaths before she could walk. She told Marte she would return in the morning if the weather allowed. She said this the way she might have said she would finish a job on a boat, not as a favor, but as a statement about unfinished work. Marte watched her go. The wind came through the nave and pulled at the silk on the floor, rippling it in the lantern light like something alive and waiting. The next morning, Barbaro returned before Marte had finished feeding the stove. She brought her sailmaker's palm, a leather strap fitted across the hand with a metal dimple for pushing heavy needles, and a spool of waxed linen thread she said had been sitting in her nephew's barn since the end of the river work. She set both on the stone block and told Marte to bring the netting. The second lesson was suspension. Barbaro explained it through the netting itself, not through words. She gathered a section of cotton cord web and had Marte hold one edge while she threaded a rope through the intersections. Then she hung a stone from the center of the web. "Pull one cord," she said. Marte pulled. The stone tilted, but held. The weight passed through a dozen intersections, each cord carrying a fraction. "Now cut one cord." Marte cut. The web shifted, redistributed, held. "That is how you hang the silk," Barbaro said. "The net carries the load across many points. The ropes connect the net to the wall. The silk fills the shape like water fills a bucket. If you hang silk from ropes alone, it will tear at every knot. If you hang it from a net, it can sag and shift and still hold." This was the design that Marte had sensed but could not build. The balloon's original netting had been made exactly for this purpose, to distribute the envelope's weight across the basket frame. Barbaro recognized it because the same principle held a sail to a yard. Load belongs to rope, not cloth. They spent the remainder of that day untangling the net sections and matching them to the silk panels. Barbaro sat when her ankle demanded it and stood when the work demanded it, and she did not acknowledge the cost either way. By afternoon, they had laid out a crude map of the dome, the largest intact panels at the center, the patch sections at the edges, the netting draped over everything like a cage waiting to be lifted. Jonas helped by carrying rope and holding lanterns. He had stopped asking if they were building a tent. He watched Barbaro's hands with the concentration of a child who senses that competence is being demonstrated, even if he does not yet understand the skill. Outside, the sky had turned the shade of iron that Tolif had warned her about. The real cold was close now. She could smell it. She had a mentor. She had a method. She had silk and rope and a stove that might be enough. But the hook that held her test rigging was pulling loose from the wall. Her fuel was down to 5 days at most, and Reverend Whitcomb had told her he would return with the trustees on Saturday. Saturday was 4 days away. The dome was not yet a dome. It was a pile of silk on a burned floor with 2 good patches, and a prayer made of physics, and the temperature was still falling. Barbaro arrived each morning before light, and stayed until her ankle would no longer hold argument. She did not call what they were doing an experiment. She called it rigging, the same word she had used on the river for any job that involved hanging weight from fixed points without killing someone underneath. The third day was rope work. Barbaro had Marte salvage iron hooks from the old pew anchors, heavy forged brackets that had been bolted into the limestone to hold the oak benches in place. The fire had burned the pews, but left the brackets seated in stone. 4 of them held firm when Marte hung her weight from them. 2 others shifted, and Barbaro told her to leave those alone. A hook that shifted under a woman's weight would tear free under 100 pounds of wet silk in a wind gust. For the anchors that held, Barbaro showed Marte how to drive wooden wedges into the mortar gaps around the bracket shafts, locking them tighter than the original bolts. She split the wedges from dry oak scraps with Marte's broken saw and shaped them with a hatchet borrowed from Randy Moen. Where the walls had no brackets, they used window arches. The lancet openings were narrow and deep, and a rope looped through the stonework at the arch peak could bear weight if the stone lip was padded with folded cloth to prevent the rope from sawing through under tension. They also raised 2 interior poles. Marte felled saplings from the timber belt, green wood, too wet to burn efficiently, but strong enough to bear lateral load. She lashed 2 together with wet rawhide cord, which shrank as it dried and locked the joint solid. Each assembled pole stood roughly 14 feet tall. Barbaro directed their placement, one near the center of the nave, one offset toward the vestry end where the living space would be concentrated. The poles would support the dome's crown where no wall anchor could reach. By the third afternoon, they had 8 anchor points, 4 wall brackets, 2 window arches, and 2 poles. The rope cradle began as a web of lines running between these points, crossing the nave at roughly 10 feet high. The netting would drape over the cradle. The silk would drape over the netting. The mouth of the inverted envelope would hang above the stove, open to receive rising heat. It sounded simple. It was not simple. The 4th day brought the first real failure. They hauled the silk upward, using a system of ropes threaded through the anchor points, Marte pulling from below, while Barbaro directed from her stone block, watching the tension lines for uneven strain. The silk rose in sections, heavy and unwilling. When the center panel reached the cradle ropes, the weight shifted suddenly to the west wall bracket. Limestone dust sifted down. A wedge cracked. The bracket held, but the rope slipped 2 inches through the window arch padding, and the entire western edge of the silk dropped 4 feet in a single lurch that snapped a netting cord and sent dust and debris raining onto the stove. Jonas, who had been feeding the fire, threw himself sideways. A section of silk brushed the stovepipe. The varnish hissed. Marte smelled burning oil before she saw the scorch, a brown line 2 inches long on a panel she had not yet patched. Barbaro said one word, "Down." They lowered everything. Marte's hands were shaking. The scorch mark was not a hole, but it was a warning that arrived with the smell of what a church full of varnished silk would become if flame reached it. Barbaro's 3rd lesson came from that failure. Smoke and heat needed separate paths. The stovepipe carried smoke upward, but if the pipe passed through or near the silk, any failure, a joint loosening, a backdraft, a blocked pipe, could send flame against fabric. Barbaro designed a low sheet iron baffle from scrap metal Marte had found in the vestry. The baffle sat between the stove and the silk mouth, deflecting the pipe's radiant heat downward while allowing the pipe to draw smoke away at an angle. The stove body still warmed the air beneath the silk opening, but the pipe itself passed through a gap in the silk near the wall, where a stone ledge created natural clearance. It took half a day to build and position the baffle, half a day that Marte did not have. The 5th day was patching. The largest tear, nearly 4 feet along a weakened seam, received a double-layered repair. Flour sacking on the inside, a wide silk scrap from a ruined panel on the outside, stitched through all 3 layers with Barbaro's waxed linen thread, and sealed with varnish scrapings Marte had spent 2 evenings collecting from the folded seams. She warmed the varnish scrapings in a tin cup near the stove until they softened into a sticky paste, then pressed the paste into every needle hole and seam edge with her thumb. The work split her fingertips further. Blood spotted the thread. Barbaro watched without comment until the stitching was done, then inspected every inch by holding the panel between Marte and the lantern. Where light leaked through, Marte sealed again. 3 smaller tiers received the same treatment. By evening, Barbro declared the patching sufficient for a test inflation, not perfect. Sufficient. She said this the way a river hand says a hull will make the next crossing, not a promise, but a professional estimate with the understanding that the river did not care about estimates. Physical toll accumulated visibly. Marte's hands were cracked and dark. She had lost weight she could not afford to lose, her wrists narrowing inside her sleeves. She ate cornmeal twice a day and gave Jonas the thicker portion. Barbro brought dried venison from her nephew's stores and said nothing about charity. She simply placed the meat beside the stove and ate some herself, so it would look like shared rations rather than a gift. Jonas's cough had worsened. The smoke from the failed rigging attempt had settled in his lungs, and now every cold gust that poured through the nave set him off in fits that bent him double. Marte kept him in the vestry as much as possible, but the vestry was barely warmer than the nave. The quilt across the opening was now supplemented with silk scraps and pinned flour sacking, but the draft still found its way through. The fuel situation was worse than the woodpile suggested. Marte had been burning deadfall, branches, wind-broken limbs, a few standing dead saplings she had sawed down, and deadfall burns fast and uneven. Barbro estimated they had 3 days of fuel at current consumption. 3 days, and the dome was not yet hanging. Barbro's 4th lesson was the one that frightened Marte most. It came on the 6th evening, after they had successfully hung 1/4 of the silk from the eastern wall anchors as a test. "Warm air holds moisture," Barbro said. She was sitting by the stove, rubbing her ankle with the flat of her hand. "Every breath you take puts water into the air. The stove puts more. When that wet air touches cold silk, the water comes out, condensation. It will drip." Marte had already noticed. The test section of silk, hanging in the cold nave, was beaded with moisture on the inside, where stove-warmed air had risen against it. "If you seal the dome completely," Barbro continued, "you will drown the silk from the inside, and the dripping will soak your bedding, your meal, your wood. Wet wood does not burn. Wet blankets do not warm, and air that cannot exchange will poison you before morning." The solution was a controlled vent. Barbro showed Marte how to leave a small opening at the dome's lowest edge, not a gap, but a slit held with a cord tie that could be loosened or tightened from the sleeping area. Open the vent and fresh air entered from below, while stale, wet air escaped through the slit. Close the vent, and the dome sealed tight, but moisture accumulated. The balance between warmth and breathable air would be a nightly negotiation, and getting it wrong in either direction could be fatal. Marte practiced the cord tie until she could adjust it by feel in the dark. She tied knots at intervals so she could count how far open the vent was without seeing it. "You will wake at 2 in the morning and the air will feel thick," Barbro said. "Open the vent 1 knot. You will wake again at 4 and the cold will be creeping in. Close it 1 knot. This is not comfort. This is management." Marte nodded. She understood management. She had been managing since Tolif died, managing meal, managing fuel, managing Jonas's declining strength, managing the distance between what she had and what she needed. Adding one more thing to manage did not scare her. What scared her was the arithmetic of everything failing at once. The vent too open during a wind gust, the stove going cold, the silk tearing, Jonas's fever climbing, and no one to hold the ladder if a patch blew loose at 3 in the morning. The 7th day was the second hanging attempt. This time they raised the silk in stages, 1 anchor point at a time, checking tension at each step. Barbro stood below with a broom handle, prodding the netting to test for uneven load. When the western bracket took weight, she had Marte redistribute by tightening the center pole rope before adding the next section. It took the full day. By late afternoon, the balloon envelope hung inverted from the cradle, its mouth roughly 6 feet above the stove, its crown stretching toward the nave's center. The silk was slack, wrinkled, sagging in places where patches made the fabric heavier. It looked nothing like a dome. It looked like a collapsed lung hanging from a skeleton. Barbaro told Marte to light the stove. Not a full fire. 3 sticks of dry kindling and 1 split piece of deadfall. The smoke rose through the pipe. The heat rose through the mouth. For 30 seconds, nothing changed. Then the silk moved. A ripple passed through the nearest panel, a shudder like skin twitching. The fabric lifted 1 inch. Dust fell from the folds. Another inch. The wrinkles tightened. The sag at the center drew upward. The mouth of the envelope, ringed with rope, widened slightly as the pressure inside increased. Jonas was standing near the vestry opening. He whispered that it was breathing. The silk rose to a low canopy, not yet a dome, not the full inflation that a proper fire would produce, but a shape, a contained shape. Air near the floor where Jonas stood was still cold, but Marte, standing closer to the stove, felt warmth gathering under the fabric in a way she had not felt since the last time she had stood in a room with a ceiling. Not blazing warmth, not comfort, but the difference between air that moved and air that stayed. Barbaro pressed her palm flat against the silk from below. The fabric was warm, not hot. The stove was small, and the fire was deliberate, but warm enough that her hand did not flinch away. She moved to the edge of the canopy where the silk met the wall. Cold air pooled there, and the temperature difference was sharp enough to feel in 2 steps. "The center works," Barbaro said. "The edges do not. You will need to sleep near the stove, not against the wall. And you will need to keep the fire smaller than you think. Too much heat, and the silk will strain the ropes. Too little, and the dome collapses." She marked practical signs. Butter softened near the bedding meant the temperature was livable. Water in a tin cup that did not skin with ice meant the dome was holding. Breath fog that thinned under the silk meant the warm air was staying where it was put. It was not a triumph, it was a proof. The silk could hold air. The air could hold heat. The stove could warm a space it could contain. Whether it could hold through a real storm, through a full night, through wind and deep cold, and a child's fever and a blocked stove pipe was a question the test could not answer. Reverend Whitcomb returned on the 7th evening. He came with Deputy Vale and the church treasurer, a thin man named Fenton who carried a lantern and a ledger as though foreclosure required bookkeeping. Whitcomb stopped 3 paces inside the nave. The silk hung above him, slack and strange in the lantern light. The stove glowed through its cracked door. The air inside the rough canopy was noticeably different from the air in the open nave, not warm, but still, as though the wind had been told to wait outside. He looked at the rigging, at the anchor points, at the baffle, at the vent cord hanging within reach of the bedding, at Jonas, asleep on a pallet of straw and flowers sacking with the quilt folded double over him, and his cough temporarily quiet. Whitcomb's objection had shifted. He no longer said it could not work. He said it might kill her while working. "Fire," he said. "This is an oil-coated fabric suspended above an open flame. One spark through the baffle, one stovepipe failure, one gust that pushes the silk against the iron, and you have a burning ceiling over a sleeping child." "The baffle separates the pipe from the silk," Marte said. "The vent opens from below. If I smell smoke where smoke should not be, I open the vent and the dome deflates." "And if you are asleep?" "Then I die no differently than I would without the silk, except that without it I'd die of cold instead of fire. At least the fire would be warm. Whitcomb did not smile. Fenton wrote something in his ledger. Vale stood near the entrance and said nothing. Whitcomb told Marte he would not authorize her removal tonight, but he would return after the first hard weather. If the structure survived, he would reconsider. If it did not, he expected her to accept placement for Jonas. He left. The wind followed him in and pushed the silk canopy sideways. The ropes creaked. One anchor rope hummed like a plucked string. The silk settled again when the wind dropped. Barbaro, who had been watching from the vestry with her arms folded, said, "He is not wrong about the fire." "I know," Marte said. "He's wrong about the alternative. Cold kills quieter than fire, and no one writes it in a ledger." A blue-black line of weather had been building in the northwest for 2 days. Travelers coming through the Salt River Road reported a hard front crossing the prairie, the kind of cold that killed livestock in the open and split water barrels in barns. Wind arrived before snow, a low constant pressure that made the church walls hum like a struck bell. Marte stood in the nave that night and watched the silk canopy shift in currents she could not see. The fabric moved like something alive, rippling, tightening, easing, responding to drafts that entered through the lancet windows and eddied around the stone walls. The stove was burning the last of her best deadfall. The fuel she had left was green wood, bark, and a few twisted roots that would smoke more than they warmed. The dome had survived a test firing. It had not survived a storm. The storm was coming. She could feel it in the walls, in the way the air tasted of metal and dust, in the silence that fell when even the wind held its breath before pushing harder. She checked the vent cord. She checked the baffle. She checked the anchor ropes one by one, hanging her weight from each and listening for the sound of stone shifting. She banked the fire low and wrapped Jonas in the quilt and lay beside him on the pallet. The silk hung above them in the dark, a second sky between them and the real one. She could hear it move. She could feel the air press against her face when the fabric swelled with a gust and then relaxed. It was like sleeping inside something that was breathing. She did not sleep. The storm broke at 3 a.m. on the 12th of December, not with a single assault, but with a grinding escalation that turned the church from shelter into battleground. Wind came first. It hit the limestone walls from the northwest and split into currents that poured through the lancet windows and over the wall tops where the roof had been. Snow followed, not falling but driven, entering the nave from above and from every opening the fire had left in the stone. Within the first hour, an inch of white covered the charred floor of the nave outside the silk canopy. Inside, the canopy caught the snow that fell from directly above and sagged under the accumulating weight. Marte fed the stove before dawn because Jonas was shaking hard enough to rattle the bed frame. She pushed 2 pieces of green wood through the cracked door and waited for the fire to catch. The green wood hissed and smoked and produced a reluctant flame that wavered whenever the wind gusted through the nave. Complication 1 landed with Jonas. His fever had been climbing for 2 days, and now his skin radiated heat that Marte could feel through the quilt. His cough had turned wet and deep, the sound of lungs filling with what they should not hold. He needed warmth. He needed dry air. He needed a room, a real room, with a ceiling and sealed walls, and a stove that could hold its fire against the wind. He had a silk bag hanging from ropes in a roofless church. Marte pressed her hand against his forehead and felt the arithmetic change. This was no longer about surviving winter. This was about surviving tonight. She fed the stove harder, 3 sticks, then a 4th. The fire strengthened and the dome responded. The silk swelled outward, lifting from its slack sag into a tighter curve. The air under the canopy warmed. Not enough. She added a fifth piece. The silk strained against the ropes. A creak echoed from the center pole. Complication 2 arrived through the stovepipe. Wind gusting over the open wall tops created a downdraft that reversed the pipe's draw. Smoke that should have risen and escaped instead backed into the pipe joint, leaked from the seam where the sections fit together, and pooled under the silk canopy. The dome, designed to trap warm air, trapped smoke with equal efficiency. Marte smelled it before she saw it. The air under the silk thickened. Jonas coughed, a different cough, sharper, a cough that was not illness, but poison. Marte's eyes watered. She reached for the vent cord and pulled it open 2 knots. Cold air rushed in from below, mixing with the smoke, diluting it, but also stealing heat. The temperature near the stove dropped. The temperature near Jonas dropped faster. She was trapped between 2 kinds of death. Seal the dome, and the smoke would suffocate them. Open the dome, and the cold would take Jonas's fever past the point his body could fight it. Complication 3 walked through the nave entrance wearing a heavy coat and a face that expected to find corpses. Warren Pike arrived with 2 men and a sled. He said Reverend Whitcomb had authorized immediate removal. He said the storm made the structure a lethal hazard. He said he was here to save the boy. He was lying. Whitcomb had said he would return after the weather, not during it. Pike had come during the storm precisely because the storm gave him cover. In the chaos of wind and snow and a sick child, who would argue? Who would check? Pike stood outside the silk canopy and looked up at the half-inflated dome, glowing amber from the stove light, smoke wisping from the vent opening. He called it a death lantern. He told Marte she had hours at most before the silk collapsed, the fire caught, or the smoke finished what the cold had started. "Give me the boy," Pike said. "I will take him to Mrs. Fenton. You can stay and die with your circus rag, if you choose." "You will not touch him," Marte said. Her voice was steady, but her hands were not. She was holding the vent cord in one hand and a stove poker in the other, and the smoke was still pooling above her head. Pike's 2 men stood near the nave entrance. One of them, a younger man named Niels Assen, looked uncomfortable. He kept glancing at the silk overhead with the expression of someone who did not understand what he was seeing but sensed it was more complicated than he had been told. If you are invested in this story, hit subscribe and stay with us, because the next choice decides whether the dome becomes shelter or coffin. Pike did not leave. He stood outside the canopy in the open nave, where wind-driven snow was accumulating on his shoulders, and watched Marte deal with the smoke. He was waiting. He believed time was on his side. Every minute the smoke pooled. Every minute Jonas coughed. Every minute the storm pushed harder against the silk. The odds shifted toward the outcome he wanted. But Marte was not frozen. She was remembering her father's freight shed. The candle held near cracks. Moving air steals heat, but sealed air without breath becomes poison. The problem was not that the dome was failing. The problem was that the stovepipe had lost its draw. Fix the draw, and the smoke would clear. The dome would do the rest. Barbro had left an iron rod beside the stove, a straight piece of stock from the old vestry railing, 3 feet long, meant for clearing ash from the pipe joints. Marte shut the stove door to cut the smoke's source. The fire dimmed behind the iron. Then she opened the pipe joint at the first elbow and pushed the rod upward, scraping the interior walls where wind-driven soot and a twist of frozen condensation had created a partial blockage. Soot rained down inside the pipe. She heard the obstruction break loose, a wet crunch followed by a sudden pull of air through the pipe. The draw returned. She closed the joint and opened the stove door 1 inch. Smoke rose through the pipe instead of pooling under the silk. The air cleared. She pulled the vent cord closed, one knot at a time, and felt the dome respond. The silk tightened. The warmth returned. Not fast. The cold had entered during the minutes the vent was open, but steadily, the way heat builds in a sealed room when the fire has time to work. Jonas was still shaking. She wrapped him tighter, pressed her body against his back, and held the vent cord in her free hand. Pike watched this from outside the canopy. He was standing in snow that now reached his boot tops. The wind cut through the nave with a sound like tearing cloth. His coat was good, but his ears were red and his breathing had shortened in the cold. Niels Asen, Pike's younger hired man, had gone outside to check the sled team. He had been gone 10 minutes, then 15. Pike sent the other man to find him. The other man came back dragging Niels by the arm. Niels was staggering. His lips were blue-gray. He had tried to lead the horses to the lee side of the church wall, and the wind had knocked him against the limestone, and the cold had reached into his chest and seized something. He collapsed inside the nave in the open air, in the snow that had drifted through the absent roof. His body was less than 8 feet from the edge of the silk canopy, and the difference between where he lay and where Marte sat was the difference between a room and the sky. Marte did not wait for Pike's permission. She pulled Niels under the silk by his coat collar. He was heavy and half-conscious, and his hands were white. She dragged him onto the floor near the stove and stripped his wet gloves and pressed his hands between hers. Pike started to speak. Marte said, "He is inside now. If you want to take him back out, do it yourself." Pike did not take him out. He stood outside the canopy and watched Marte warm the man who had come to remove her. The irony was visible to everyone in the nave except Pike himself, who saw only a complication in his plan and not the argument it made against him. The dome held through the night. But holding was not the same as standing still. The wind did not stop. It shifted twice, each time sending new drafts through different windows, and each shift changed the pressure on the silk from a different angle. The first shift came from the east, pushing the canopy sideways until the center pole rope sang with tension, and the western anchor bracket groaned in its mortar seat. Marte lay in the dark, listening to the sounds the dome made, the creak of rope, the whisper of silk sliding against netting, the occasional pop of a stitch adjusting under load. And she learned to read them the way a sailor reads the sounds of rigging at night. A steady creak meant the load was distributed. A sudden pop meant a stitch had broken. A whistle meant a seam was leaking. Twice the canopy lurched sideways and the ropes groaned, and Marte reached for the vent cord, adjusting by feel in the dark, counting knots with her fingers. She opened one knot to equalize the pressure inside the dome with the gust outside, felt the silk settle, then closed it again before the cold could reach Jonas. At midnight, a patch seam near the west arch began to hiss, a thin whistle of air escaping where the flour sack backing had separated from the varnished surface. The leak was small, but growing. Cold air streamed in through the gap like water through a cracked hull. Marte climbed the ladder in mittens stiff with ice. The ladder was a salvaged piece of the old choir loft framing, and it shook under her weight. She pressed a fresh flour sack patch over the leak with hide glue, while Barbro held the ladder from below. Barbro had come through the storm. She had seen the smoke behaving wrong from a quarter mile, rising, then stopping, then dispersing sideways instead of climbing, and she had known what it meant. She arrived at the church covered in snow, limping worse than Marte had ever seen, her breath coming in shallow draws that spoke of a chest fighting the cold air. She did not explain her presence. She simply took the ladder base and held it, and when Marte came down, she handed her a cup of water that was still liquid because she had carried it inside her coat against her body. The stove burned through the night at a rate that should not have been enough. Marte fed it green wood and bark and twisted roots, small amounts at steady intervals, never enough to make the dome strain, and never so little that the fire died. She learned the rhythm. One piece every 40 minutes kept the air warm enough. Two pieces made the dome swell and the ropes creak dangerously. No pieces for an hour, and the temperature dropped so fast that frost began forming on the silk's interior surface. The silk did the rest. It held the heat where bodies were. It turned a fraction of a cord into a livable temperature by refusing to let the warmth escape into the open sky above. Every cubic foot of air that the stove warmed stayed inside the canopy instead of rising through the absent roof. The stone walls blocked the wind. The silk blocked the escape. Between the two, a space the size of a large bedroom maintained a temperature that was uncomfortable but survivable. By 3 in the morning, butter near the bedding had softened. By 4, the water in the tin cup had not skinned with ice. By 5, Jonas's shaking had slowed. His breathing was still wet and heavy with the fever's work, but the desperate rattling had eased. By dawn, his skin was warm from fever and from the air around him rather than from his own failing body, and he was sleeping instead of shuddering. Niels Assen's hands regained color by midnight. He had not spoken since Marte dragged him under the silk. He sat against the wall inside the canopy and watched the fabric move above him, watched the stove light glow amber through the translucent panels, watched Marte adjust the vent cord and feed the fire and climb the ladder and come down and check Jonas and check the ropes and check the fuel pile. He watched all of this for hours. Then he said quietly, as though admitting something he had not wanted to know, "It is warmer in here than in Pike's stable." Pike had left some time before dawn. No one had seen him go. He had stood outside the canopy for as long as pride allowed, watching warmth he could not access, watching his hired man rescued by the woman he had come to evict. Then the cold, or the shame, or both, had driven him out into the storm, and his sled tracks were buried under new snow by morning. 2 miles south, a bachelor farmer named Ephraim Cole refused to leave his lean-to during the storm. He had more wood than Marte. He had a bigger stove. He fed the fire all night, splitting logs by lantern light, filling the iron belly until the stovepipe glowed orange. He believed what every practical man believed, that the answer to cold was more fire. Randy Moen found him alive the next morning, but barely. His water bucket had frozen solid beside the stove. Frost had crept up the inside walls of the lean-to despite the roaring fire, because every draft that entered through the gaps sucked the heat out faster than the stove could replace it. His fingers were frostbitten. His woodpile, which had been 3 full cords, was nearly gone. He had burned 3 cords in one night and nearly died. Marte had burned a fraction of a cord and kept 4 people alive. The difference was not courage or strength or stubbornness. The difference was what Marte's father had tried to tell her with a candle held against a cracked wall 23 years earlier. Stop the draft first, then count your fuel. Morning light entered the nave through the lancet windows and through the absent roof. Snow lay inside the church in drifts that followed the wind's path, white against charred black, filling the spaces between the wall and the canopy's edge. Inside the silk dome, the air was still. Not warm by any standard a comfortable person would recognize, but still. The candle beside Jonas's bed burned straight. Marte sat beside the stove and held her cracked hands near the iron. Barbro sat on the stone block with her bad ankles stretched before her and her eyes closed. Niels Assen sat against the wall with his hands wrapped in Marte's spare wool scraps. Jonas slept. Pike had left during the night. No one had seen him go. His sled tracks were buried under new snow by morning. The dome hung above them, dull brown and amber, and faded crimson where old dress silk patches had once been stitched into the balloon's envelope. It was stained with smoke and beaded with condensation, and scarred with patches and ugly with rope. It was the most beautiful thing Marte had ever built. But she did not say this. She opened the stove door and fed it one more piece of wood and listened to the silk breathe above her. The storm was not over. The winter was not over. Pike was not finished. Whitcomb had not yet seen what the dome could do on its worst night. Jonas's fever had not broken, and the fuel pile, even with the dome's efficiency, was still shrinking. She had survived the first test. The question was no longer whether the silk could hold heat. The question was what she would become now that the town had seen it hold. The morning after the storm, Reverend Whitcomb walked to the church, expecting to find what experience had taught him to expect: a collapsed shelter, a frozen child, a woman who had gambled on ingenuity and lost to arithmetic, the way the frontier always demanded. He found the nave full of snow. Drifts climbed the interior walls and covered the charred floor in white that glowed under the weak December sun pouring through the absent roof. The air in the open nave was sharp enough to sting his nostrils. His breath hung in clouds. Inside the silk canopy, Jonas was sitting up on the pallet eating cornmeal mush. The quilt was folded beside him, not wrapped around him. The tin cup of water beside the stove had not frozen. Marte was adjusting the vent cord with one hand and feeding the stove a piece of bark with the other, and Barbro Stensland was asleep on a folded blanket near the wall, with her bad ankle propped on a stone. Niels Asen was gone. He had left before dawn without waking anyone, taking nothing except the wool scraps Marte had wrapped around his hands. Whitcomb removed his hat. He stood just inside the canopy's edge and felt the air change around him, not warm, not what any man accustomed to a proper house would call comfortable, but still, quiet. The wind that screamed through the nave above did not reach the space beneath the silk. He looked at the rigging, at the anchor points, at the baffle, at the stovepipe drawing cleanly, at the patches, ugly and broad, holding against the weight of accumulated snow on the canopy's outer surface. He said, "I counted cords and walls. I did not count the air." Marte did not answer immediately. She fed the stove another piece of bark and watched the flames settle. "Your numbers were right," she said. 6 cords for a room without a ceiling, but this is not a room without a ceiling. This is a smaller room inside the larger one. The stove does not heat the church. It heats the air that the silk holds in place. Whitcomb nodded slowly. He was a man who had spent his life counting resources and matching them against needs, and the discovery that he had been counting the wrong thing did not shame him. It corrected him. There was a difference, and his face showed that he understood which one this was. "How much wood did you burn through the night?" he asked. "Less than 1 full armload of split pieces, mostly bark and green wood." Whitcomb looked at the snow drifted in the nave outside the canopy. He looked at the stove, which was smaller than the one in his own kitchen. He looked at Jonas, who was eating. "I will tell the trustees the structure may remain," he said, "but I want to see the baffle and the vent before I go." Marte showed him. She explained the baffle's angle, the vent cord's knot system, the relationship between stove output and dome pressure. She explained it through the objects themselves, pointing and demonstrating, not lecturing. Whitcomb listened the way a man listens when he has decided to learn rather than to judge. When he left, he paused at the nave entrance and looked back at the silk dome, glowing faintly amber in the morning light, snow melting where it met the warm fabric. "Mrs. Brecka," he said, "I owe you an apology for the arithmetic." "You owe me nothing," she said. The arithmetic was right. I just changed the room. Randy moan came the following day. She did not bring broth this time. She brought questions. She had heard about the storm night from 3 sources. From Niels Austen, who told the men at Kessler's store that the air inside the silk was warmer than Pike's stable, and then went quiet when Pike walked in. From Deputy Vale, who had checked the church at dawn and reported to the township that the widow and boy were alive and the structure was holding. And from Ephraim Cole's neighbor, who described finding Cole frostbitten beside a stove that had consumed 3 cords and failed to keep his water bucket from freezing. Randy stood inside the canopy and held her hand flat above the stove. Then she walked to the edge where the silk met the wall and held her hand there. She felt the difference. She counted the steps between warm and cold. She looked at the vent cord, at the knots, at the way the silk trapped rising air and held it. My children sleep in a loft, Randy said. The loft has gaps along the eaves where the boards have shrunk. Every winter the cold comes through those gaps and sits on their blankets like a stone. I have stuffed rags and straw into the gaps every year and it never holds. Is the gap along the top or the bottom? Marte asked. The top, where the roof meets the wall. Then the warm air from below rises through the gap and pulls cold air in behind it. You are not losing heat through the gap. You are pumping it out. Randy was quiet for a moment. She had lived in that house for 6 winters and fought those gaps for 6 winters and had never understood why the rags failed. The answer was not better rags. The answer was understanding which direction the air moved. Marte showed her the candle test. She held a candle near the vent opening and showed how the flame bent toward the gap, warm air rushing out, pulling cold air in below. Then she sealed the vent, and the flame stilled. Seal the top of the gap, not the bottom, Marte said. Use oiled cloth, not rags. Rags breathe. Oiled cloth does not. And make the seal wider than the gap, stitched or nailed flat against the board, so the air cannot find an edge to peel back. Randy asked if she could bring her oldest daughter to see. Others followed. A farmer named Grindheim asked whether wagon canvas could make a smaller warm enclosure over a bed. Marte said yes, if the canvas was oiled and the opening faced the stove, and the enclosure was small enough for body heat alone to maintain it. She sketched it for him on a piece of charred board with a nail, a frame of bent willow hoops, canvas draped over, open at one end, closed at the other. A bed tent. Not the dome, but the dome's principle reduced to a single body. The school teacher, a young woman named Clara Haugen, asked whether the church ruin could shelter emergency travelers during storms. Marte said the dome could hold 5 or 6 people if they stayed near the center, but more than that, and the air would foul faster than the vent could clear it. She said this with the precision of someone who had spent a night managing the balance between warmth and breath, and knew where the limits lived. Each question confirmed something Marte had suspected during the storm. The dome was not a miracle. It was a principle made visible. Every house in the settlement had the same problem. Air moving through gaps, carrying heat into the sky, forcing stoves to burn harder than they needed to. The silk was not the lesson. The lesson was the air. She said to Randy before Randy left, "Do not copy the church. Copy the reason." Warren Pike heard about Whitcomb's visit within hours. He heard about Randy's questions the same day. He heard about the farmer and the school teacher by evening. Each report eroded something he had built, not a structure, but a narrative. The narrative that Marte Breca was a fool, that the silk was a waste, that the church ruin was a death trap waiting for the county to act. The narrative had been useful. It had kept sympathy from consolidating around the widow. It had kept the trustees cautious. It had kept Pike's acquisition of the Brecky claim and tools unquestioned, because who would challenge a man cleaning up after a tragedy that everyone agreed was inevitable? But the dome had survived the storm. The boy was alive. A hired man had been saved by the woman Pike had tried to remove. And now people were visiting the church not to gawk, but to learn. The ground beneath Pike's position was softening, and he felt it the way a man standing on a riverbank feels the mud give before the slide. He shifted tactics. At Kessler's store, Pike told the men that Marte's dome was an accident waiting to happen. He described the scorched silk, the smoke crisis, the fire risk that Whitcomb himself had identified. He said that if the county allowed women to build smoke tents in public buildings, someone would die, and the trustees would hang for it. He used Whitcomb's own concerns as ammunition, quoting the Reverend's fire warning while omitting his subsequent reversal. He told the timber cutter that the balloon wreckage was military salvage and that the government could seize it at any time. He told Deputy Vale that he was preparing a petition to the county board to forbid unsupervised use of enclosed fabric structures near open flame. The threats were real. Pike had money, standing, and the patience to use paper where force had failed. The dome had survived winter. It had not yet survived law. January deepened. The dome held through 2 more storms, neither as severe as the first, but both cold enough to test the patching and the rigging. Marte learned the dome's behavior the way a riverman learns a current, by repetition, by listening, by adjusting before the crisis arrived instead of during it. Barbro came every day that her ankle allowed. Some days were good. Some days she arrived leaning on a stick her nephew had cut for her, and she sat on the stone block and directed rather than worked. But she was always present, and her presence had shifted from teacher to collaborator. They improved the dome together. The double rope suspension was Barbro's design, a secondary set of lines that kept the silk 2 inches away from the stovepipe at every point, so that even if the primary anchor shifted, the fabric could not touch hot iron. The drip cord system was Marte's invention and Barbro's refinement. A series of twisted thread lines hung inside the dome at the lowest points where condensation gathered, channeling water droplets down the threads and into a pot rather than onto blankets. Barbro added wax to the thread so the water would follow the cord instead of beating and dropping. The removable smoke baffle was rebuilt twice. The first version, made from scrap sheet iron, warped after 3 weeks of daily heating and cooling. Barbro showed Marte how to flatten a tin container and score it with a nail so it would bend along controlled lines instead of warping randomly. The second baffle lasted the rest of the winter. Barbro's backstory arrived in pieces, the way real people share their histories, not in a single confession, but in fragments attached to the work. While stitching a new patch, Barbro mentioned that she had learned the saddle stitch from a German sailmaker in St. Louis, who could sew a seam that held in a hurricane but could not boil an egg without burning it. While adjusting the rope cradle, she mentioned that her limp came from a loading crane that had swung loose in Memphis and caught her ankle against a bollard. She said it the way she might mention weather, as a fact that had happened to her body and changed its terms without changing her intention to use it. One evening, while Marte was teaching Jonas to wax thread by rolling it between his palms, Barbro said she had once had a daughter. The daughter had died of scarlet fever on a packet boat between Natchez and Vicksburg. The boat's surgeon had told Barbro that the child needed cool air and rest. The cabin was hot and airless. Barbro had carried her daughter to the deck, where the river air was cooler, and the child had slept and then stopped sleeping. She did not say this for sympathy. She said it because Marte had asked why Barbro came to the church every day when the walk cost her so much pain. Barbro said, "Because a child in a cold room is a problem I know how to solve. The other kind I could not solve. I prefer the kind I can." Marte did not answer. She rolled wax thread between her palms and let the silence carry the weight that words would have dropped. They clashed once. It was late January, during a warm spell that softened the snow and sent meltwater running through the nave. Marte wanted to expand the dome's footprint by adding a lower sleeping enclosure, a smaller silk tent within the larger canopy, close to the floor, where body heat alone could maintain warmth during low fuel nights. Barbaro said the additional rigging would strain the anchor points beyond what the mortar could hold. Marte said the anchors had held through 3 storms. Barbaro said storms test the same points in the same directions, but a lower enclosure would pull the ropes at new angles the brackets had never faced. They argued for an hour. Jonas sat near the stove and watched them the way children watch adults when the adults have forgotten the child is there. The argument was not about the enclosure. It was about who understood the limits of the structure, the woman who had built it or the woman who had taught her how. Barbaro won. Not because she was right, Marte's enclosure design was sound, but because she identified a compromise. Hang the lower enclosure from the existing rope cradle using separate ties so that its weight transferred to the same anchor points at the same angles, rather than creating new stress vectors. The enclosure would be smaller than Marte wanted. It would also hold. They built it together. It took 2 days. When they finished, Jonas crawled inside and fell asleep within minutes. The air in the lower enclosure, warmed by his own body, and the residual heat from the stove above, was the warmest space in the church. Barbaro pressed her palm against the silk and said, "A room small enough to keep its breath." Barbaro's cough began in early February. It was small at first, a dry catch at the end of a sentence, a pause while climbing the nave step that might have been the ankle but was not. She ignored it the way she ignored most things her body tried to tell her, by continuing to work. By mid-February, the cough was wet and persistent. She arrived at the church later each morning and left earlier. She could no longer climb the ladder, so Marte did all overhead work while Barbaro directed from below. Her hands, which had been steady enough to thread a sail needle in lamplight, began to tremble when she held them above her chest. Marte asked her to rest. Barbaro said rest was what she planned to do when the work was finished. Marte said the work was never finished. Barbaro said that was the point. Her final major lesson was not about silk or rope or fire. It came on a cold afternoon in late February when they were repairing a section of netting that had frayed where it crossed a rough stone edge. Barbaro held the netting taut, while Marte wound new cord around the damaged section. Barbaro's grip was weaker than it had been. Marte could feel the difference through the cord. "Teach the part that matters," Barbaro said. She was not looking at the netting. She was looking at the dome above them, at the patches and rope and scars and reinforcements that marked every crisis and every lesson since the first day she had walked into the ruin. Cloth changes, weather changes. The air tells the truth. Teach people to listen to the air. Marte understood. The dome was not the invention. The dome was one application of a principle. The principle was what mattered. That trapped still air was warmer than moving air. That a small sealed space was more efficient than a large open one. That the enemy was not cold but draft. If Marte taught people to patch silk, the knowledge would die when the silk wore out. If she taught them to read the air, the knowledge would outlast every material it touched. Barbaro died on the 4th of March. She had not come to the church for 3 days. On the first day, Marte assumed the ankle. On the second, she assumed the cold. On the third, she walked to the nephew's house 2 miles north through mud that was beginning to show beneath the thinning snow. She found Barbaro in bed in a small back room that smelled of wood smoke and camphor, and something else underneath, the smell of lungs that were no longer clearing what they collected. Barbaro's face was thinner than it had been a week ago, the bones showing through skin that had turned the color of old candle wax. Her breathing was shallow and wet. each inhale producing a sound like cloth tearing slowly. The nephew said the doctor from town had come and gone and said there was nothing to be done that warmth and rest could not do, and warmth and rest were not doing it. He said Barbaro had refused laudanum because it made her stupid, and she would rather hurt and think than drift and not. Marte sat beside the bed for an afternoon. She did not speak much because Barbaro did not speak much, and the silences between them had always been comfortable, the shared quiet of two people working who did not need to narrate the work. Barbaro was conscious, but her eyes wandered to the window where gray light came through, and she watched the sky with the same expression she had used when watching the dome, assessing, measuring, reading something in the air that others could not see. She held Marte's hand once, briefly, and her grip was still stronger than it should have been for a woman whose lungs were filling with what they should not hold. Her palm was calloused and warm, and Marte could feel the ridges where the sailmaker's strap had pressed its shape into the skin over 40 years. Before Marte left, Barbaro reached beneath her pillow and pulled out her sailmaker's palm, the leather strap worn smooth from decades of pushing needles through canvas. She placed it in Marte's hand. The leather was warm from Barbaro's body. The metal dimple was polished to a mirror from use. "It fits your hand better than mine now," Barbaro said. "I have been watching." Marte walked back to the church through a light snow that was already melting on the road. The dome was visible from a quarter mile, a strange amber shape inside the limestone shell, glowing faintly where the afternoon stove light caught the silk. She stood in the nave and looked up at the rigging and the patches and the rope cradle that Barbaro had designed, and she pressed the sailmaker's palm against her own hand and felt the smooth metal dimple where 10,000 needles had been pushed through canvas by a woman who understood that load belongs to rope, not cloth. She did not cry. She fed the stove and checked the vent cord and adjusted a rope that had slipped half an inch during the last wind. She did these things because they needed to be done, and because doing them was the form her grief took, the same hands, the same tools, the same work, but alone now in a way that being alone before Barbaro had never felt. The dome above her was Barbaro's architecture as much as her own. Every rope junction, every patch margin, every angle of the baffle carried the memory of a woman who had walked 2 miles on a broken ankle every morning because a child in a cold room was a problem she knew how to solve. Jonas asked where Barbaro was. Marte said Barbaro was resting. She said it knowing that she would have to say something different soon, and that the different thing would be harder than anything the winter had asked of her. She held the sailmaker's palm against her chest and felt the metal dimple press into her sternum, and she kept working because the stove would not feed itself, and the vent cord would not adjust itself, and the dome did not care about grief. The dome cared about physics. Barbaro would have approved. The secondary crisis came 3 weeks later, in late March, when the winter should have been loosening its grip, but instead delivered one final act of spite. A wet snow fell for 2 days, heavy, dense snow that clung to every surface and accumulated faster than roofs could shed it. On the second night, the schoolhouse roof, which had been weakened by a summer of deferred repairs and a winter of freeze-thaw cycling in the joints, partially collapsed along the northern eave. The ridge beam held, but 2 rafters snapped and dropped a section of roof planking into the classroom below. 14 people were inside. The school teacher, Clara Hogan, had opened the building for a community meeting, a monthly gathering where township business was discussed and grievances aired. Children had come with parents. When the roof section fell, it missed the stove by 3 feet and blocked the main door with debris. Nobody was crushed, but the collapse opened a gap in the roof 8 feet wide, and wet snow began pouring through onto people who were now trapped in a building with a failing structure above them and a blocked exit below. Clara sent her oldest student, a boy of 14, through a window to run for help. He went to the nearest house, which was Randy Moen's, and Randy sent her daughter to the church. Marte could not move the dome. The balloon silk was rigged to the church walls and could not be taken down, transported, and rehung in the schoolhouse. It was not a portable shelter. It was an installation built for one space. Barbro had designed it that way, every rope, every anchor, every tension line specific to the limestone walls and the nave's dimensions. But the dome was not what the schoolhouse needed. The schoolhouse had walls. It had most of a roof. What it had lost was a sealed ceiling over the occupied area. What it needed was the principle, not the object. Marte arrived at the schoolhouse with rope, Barbro's sailmaker's palm, a spool of waxed thread, and 3 oiled feed sacks from Randy's barn. She found the building in controlled chaos. Adults holding children away from the collapse zone, snow falling through the gap, the stove still burning but its heat rising straight through the hole and into the sky. She did not explain the theory. She worked. She assessed the collapse first. The gap was ragged, the broken rafters hanging at angles that could shift further. Snow was accumulating on the remaining roof and adding weight to the weakened structure. She told the men to brace the hanging rafters with whatever long timber they could find, benches, a spare door, a plank pried from the entryway, not to repair the roof, but to prevent further collapse while she worked below. Then she took the schoolroom curtains down from the windows, heavy cotton, not oiled but dense enough to slow air passage. She took 2 oiled tablecloths from the supply chest. She tied the curtains and tablecloths together with running stitches using the sailmaker's palm and wax thread, creating a patchwork panel roughly 12 feet by 8. The stitching was Barbro's saddle stitch, the one the German sailmaker had taught her, and Marte's hands performed it without thought, the muscle memory carrying her through the work while her mind planned the rigging. She had Randy and 2 men hold the panel above the occupied area, while she tied the corners to the remaining rafters and the ridge beam using rope looped and knotted the way Barbro had taught her, distributing load across multiple points rather than hanging dead weight from single nails. She used 4 anchor points, then added 2 more when the panel's center sagged lower than she wanted. Each knot she tied was the knot Barbro had shown her in the church nave on the 3rd day, a hitch that tightened under load instead of slipping. The panel sagged. It was not silk. It was not varnished. It would not hold warm air the way the dome held it, but it blocked the snow from falling on the people below, and it caught the rising heat from the stove long enough for the temperature in the occupied space to climb from dangerous to bearable. She adjusted the panel's edges, leaving a vent gap along the eastern wall where the roof was still intact, so that stale air could escape without opening the warm pocket to the full wind. She showed Clara how to tighten or loosen the gap by pulling a rope she had threaded through the tablecloth's hem. 1 knot open for air, Marte said. 2 knots open if the smoke thickens. Never fully closed, never fully open. Clara nodded. She had visited the church dome twice and had seen the vent cord. She understood. The schoolhouse sheltered the 14 people through the night. The panel was crude. It leaked. It sagged further as snow accumulated on top. But no one froze. The stove, freed from heating the open sky, warmed the reduced space beneath the panel enough for children to sleep and for adults to wait without the cold reaching into their bones. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who needs to hear it. By morning, men had cleared the door and temporary repairs had begun. The 14 people walked out alive because a widow had sewn curtains to tablecloths in the dark, using a dead woman's palm and a lesson about air that had started with a candle in an Ohio freight shed. Word reached Pike within hours. It reached him in the worst possible form, not as rumor, but as testimony from 14 witnesses who had spent the night under Marte's improvised ceiling. Among them were 3 men who served on the township board, the school teacher who reported to the county superintendent, and Randy Moen, who now had a story to tell that was not about a widow and a circus rag, but about a neighbor who had saved their children using rope and cloth, and the understanding that heat does not need to be made, it needs to be kept. Pike's petition to the county board, which he had been circulating for weeks, asked for a prohibition on unsupervised fabric enclosures near open flame. The petition now required him to explain why a technique that had just saved 14 people in a schoolhouse should be forbidden in a church. He could not make the argument without making himself the man who opposed what the schoolhouse survivors owed their lives to. He did not withdraw the petition. He simply stopped circulating it. The signatures he had gathered, 7 names, mostly men who owed him money or stable fees, remained on the paper. But the paper stayed in his ledger. He did not file it with the county. Marte did not know about the petition's quiet death. She was at the schoolhouse the next day helping repair the ceiling, showing the carpenter how the temporary panel's load was distributed and where the permanent repair should add bracing to prevent the same failure. She was teaching without calling it teaching. She was solving problems because problems were what she understood, and because every solved problem was an argument that Pike could not answer with paper. The dome in the church was no longer strange to the settlement. It was becoming furniture, a known thing, an accepted thing, something that men mentioned at Kessler's store, not with mockery, but with the cautious respect they reserved for methods they had not invented and could not entirely dismiss. The phrase Marte had used with Randy, "Do not copy the church, copy the reason," had traveled the way useful phrases travel in small communities. It was shorthand now. When a farmer asked how to keep his stock barn warmer, someone would say, "Count the air first." When a woman wondered why her cabin's loft was always colder than the main room, someone would say, "Where's the draft?" Marte had not set out to change the settlement. She had set out to survive a winter in a roofless church with a sick child and $9.60. But survival had produced knowledge, and knowledge had produced authority, and authority had produced something she had never had before in Missouri, a position that could not be bought by a man with a ledger and a set of other people's debts. The dome hung in the church, scarred and patched and stained with a winter's worth of smoke and condensation. It was not beautiful. It was not permanent. But it was hers, and it was proof. And the people who had laughed at the sky rag were now asking how it worked. What remained unresolved was Pike. He had not come to the church since the storm night. He had not spoken Marte's name in public since the schoolhouse rescue made his petition untenable. But he still held the paper on the Brecka tools and the cabin lease claim, and he still sat at Kessler's store with his ledger and his quiet appetite. The winter had taught him that mockery and law could not remove Marte Brecka. It had not yet taught him what would. Spring came to the Salt River timber belt the way it came to most of Missouri in 1865. Slowly, grudgingly, with false starts that punished anyone who trusted the first warm day. The snow thinned, the mud thickened. The dome's silk, which had been taut all winter from the stove's daily warmth, sagged as Marte reduced the fire to conserve what remained of her fuel. The dome breathed differently in warm weather. It relaxed. The ropes slackened. The patches, which had held under tension, wrinkled where the strain released. Marte did not take it down. She loosened the vent to its widest setting, opened the vestry door she had sealed in December, and let the spring air move through the church freely. The dome became a canopy rather than a shelter, shade rather than warmth, habit rather than necessity. Jonas played beneath it. His cough had cleared in February, and by March he was strong enough to carry rope and hold tools and ask the kind of questions that 7-year-old boys ask when they have watched adults build something they do not fully understand but know is important. The first summer was reconstruction. Marte used the time to do what the winter had not allowed: repair the dome systematically instead of desperately. She took down each panel, inspected every seam, replaced the worst patches with better ones using oiled muslin Randy had traded for labor. She re-waxed the netting where friction had worn the coating. She replaced two anchor ropes that had frayed where they crossed stone edges, using Barbro's method of padding the contact points with folded leather. She also built the smaller versions that the settlement had been asking about since the storm night. The first was for Randy's loft. It was not silk. There was no more silk, but oiled canvas stretched over a frame of bent willow hoops and lashed to the loft rafters so that it hung above the children's beds like a low ceiling within the ceiling. The warm air from the main room stove, which had always risen through the loft gaps and escaped through the eaves, now collected under the canvas panel and stayed. Randy reported that her children slept without shivering for the first time in 6 winters. The second was a bed canopy for an infant. A farmer's wife named Birgit Haugen, Clara the school teacher's older sister, had a newborn and a cabin with a drafty sleeping loft. Marte built a small enclosure of oiled muslin over the cradle, open at the bottom where the warm air from the room entered and closed at the top where it would otherwise escape. The baby slept through its first cold night without the mother waking to add blankets. The third was an emergency sick enclosure. When a timber cutter broke his leg in the woods and was carried to his cabin, Marte rigged an oiled canvas tent around his bed and placed a small iron warming pan of coals inside. The tent held the heat close to his body, while the cabin's main stove kept the room livable. The doctor who set the bone told Marte the man's recovery was faster than expected because the consistent warmth prevented the shivering that reopened wounds. Each version taught Marte something the church dome had not. The dome was large, fixed, and built from a material she could not replace. The smaller versions were portable, reproducible, and made from materials any household could obtain. The oiled canvas cost a fraction of what extra cordwood cost. The willow hoops could be cut from any creek bank. The waxed thread was the most expensive component, and a single spool lasted through a dozen projects. The principle did not require silk. It required understanding that could be passed from hand to hand like a tool, growing sharper with each person who used it. She taught through demonstration, not lecture. When Randy's oldest daughter came to learn, Marte put a candle in her hand and walked her around the cabin, holding the flame near every wall joint, every window frame, every place where boards met and air might enter. The girl marked each draft with a charcoal line on the wood. Then they sealed the worst ones with oiled cloth and flour paste, working from the top down, the lesson Marte had given Randy, now passing to the next pair of hands. When Reverend Whitcomb asked Marte to explain the principle to the township meeting, she brought the candle instead of a speech. She lit it in the schoolhouse, held it near the repaired ceiling joint, and showed the room how the flame bent where cold air entered through a gap the carpenters had missed. She sealed it with a strip of oiled cloth while the room watched. No one laughed. The men who had joked about the sky rag at Kessler's store sat in the back row and said nothing, which from those particular men was as close to an admission as Marte would ever receive. Whitcomb now opened winter meetings by asking who had checked stove draw and sleeping drafts. It became a ritual, practical, brief, the kind of habit that communities adopt when the reason behind it has been proven by a night that everyone remembers. The phrase, "count the air," entered the settlement's vocabulary the way tools enter a workshop, through use, not ceremony. When a new family arrived and asked why their cabin would not hold heat, someone always said it. Count the air. Find the draft. Seal the top first. Then measure your fuel. Warren Pike's livery stable had been built in 1859 by a man who understood horses and did not understand air. The walls were plank on frame, tight enough at the joints when new but dried and shrunk after 6 years of Missouri summers. The loft, where hay was stored, had ventilation gaps along the eaves, deliberate openings meant to prevent hay mold in summer. In winter, those gaps became chimneys that sucked warm air from the stable floor and replaced it with cold air from outside. Pike had compensated with a large stove and abundant wood. He could afford both. The stove burned through the winter months, and the stable stayed warm enough for the horses because Pike's fuel supply was effectively unlimited. He bought cordwood wholesale from the same contractors who had employed Tolliff Brecka. In November of 1865, a gale stripped shingles from the livery roof. Not enough to require rebuilding, but enough to open gaps in the roof planking that connected to the loft ventilation and created a draft system that no amount of firewood could overcome. The warm air from the stable floor rose through the loft, exited through the gaps, and pulled freezing air in through the walls and the door seams. 2 horses sickened within a week, not from cold exposure directly, but from the constant temperature cycling that weakened their lungs and left them susceptible to infection. Pike tried what he knew. He burned more wood. He blocked the door gaps with straw bales. He hung blankets across the loft opening. Each fix addressed a symptom instead of the system. The straw bales blocked low drafts, but increased the pull through the high gaps. The blankets across the loft caught warm air, but pooled moisture that dripped onto the hay and started a mold that threatened the entire winter supply. The harder he fought the air, the more it found ways around his defenses. His veterinary costs exceeded what the wood had cost. A horse he had valued at $80 developed a cough that would not clear. A second horse stopped eating in the cold. Pike did not come to the church. He sent a message through Niels Assen, who had not spoken to Pike about the storm night, and did not want to speak to Marte about Pike. The message said only that the livery had a heating problem and that Pike would pay for consultation. Marte did not respond to the message. 3 days later, Pike came himself. He walked to the church in the early morning, when the settlement was quiet and the chance of being seen was lowest. He stood in the nave entrance and looked at the dome the way he had looked at it the night of the storm from outside, unable to enter the warmth without admitting what it meant. Marte was inside, adjusting the drip cord system. Jonas was beside her, waxing thread with the competence of a boy who had been taught by 2 women who took competence seriously. Pike said, "Tell me where the air's leaving." Marte set down the cord. She looked at Pike the way Barbaro had once looked at a damaged seam, with inventory, not emotion. "You already know the price," Marte said. Pike's face tightened. He was a man accustomed to setting prices, not receiving them. He expected a dollar amount. He expected to pay for a service the way he paid for hay and stable fees and contracted labor, in money that kept the transaction clean and the power where he believed it belonged. "How much?" he asked. "You tell Reverend Whitcomb the claim on the Brecka tools was false. You tell Randy Moen what you offered me for the silk. Then I will look at your stable." The silence that followed was the loudest moment in the church since the storm. The dome above them shifted in a draft, the silk whispering against the netting. Jonas looked up from his thread. Pike could refuse. He could walk away, hire a carpenter from the county seat, pay someone who did not carry the weight of what he had done. But the carpenter would seal the gaps without understanding the system. The gaps would reopen. The horses would sicken again. And the next winter would be the same, and the winter after that, because the problem was not the gaps. The problem was the air, and Pike did not know how to read it. He said, "The tools belong to Phelps. I bought the note. The note was lawful." The note was lawful. What you told people about why you held it was not. You told Kessler's store that Tolliff owed for a broken team. Tolliff owed nothing. Phelps refused to pay the final wage, and you bought the right to collect on the refusal. Pike's jaw worked. He was not used to being told what he had done by someone who could prove it. Marte had no documents. She had something worse, the memory of a widow who had listened to every word spoken about her dead husband's name in a settlement, small enough that words traveled faster than paper. "If I tell Whitcomb, the note is finished," Pike said. "I lose the 80 cents Phelps still owes on it." "You lose 80 cents. Your horse is worth $80. Count." Pike left. He did not agree. He did not refuse. He walked out through the nave entrance and back toward town with the posture of a man whose arithmetic was betraying him. 2 days later, Reverend Whitcomb came to the church and told Marte that Warren Pike had withdrawn the claim on the Brecca tools and had acknowledged to the trustees that the original obligation had been misrepresented. Whitcomb said this carefully, the way a man says something he wants to be sure is heard correctly. He also said that Pike had told Randy Moen about the flower offer, and that Randy had responded by asking Pike how he slept at night and whether the answer was well enough without his horses. Marte went to the livery the following morning. She brought a candle and Barbro's sailmaker's palm and a coil of waxed thread, because she did not yet know whether the problem would require diagnosis alone or repair on the spot. Pike was waiting inside. He stood near the sick horse's stall with his arms folded, and his posture said everything his mouth did not, that he hated needing this, that he hated the woman providing it, and that he would endure both because the alternative was losing animals he had spent years acquiring. Marte did not acknowledge the posture. She lit the candle and began walking the stable the way her father had walked the freight shed, slow, methodical, holding the flame near every joint, every gap, every place where boards met air. The flame bent in 11 places. She marked each one with a charcoal line on the wood. Pike watched her mark his stable the way he might watch someone writing a verdict on his property. Then she stood in the center of the stable and looked up at the loft opening and the ventilation gaps and the missing shingles, and she saw the system that Pike had been fighting without understanding. The stable was not cold because it had gaps. Every stable had gaps. The stable was cold because the gaps were arranged in a pattern that created a chimney effect. Warm air pulled upward through the loft and out through the eaves, drawing cold air in through every low opening to replace it. The more Pike heated the stable, the faster the chimney pulled. He had been feeding the engine that was stealing his heat. "Your problem is not the gaps in the roof," she said. "Your problem is the gaps in the eaves. The roof gaps would not matter if the warm air was not already being pulled upward through the loft. The eaves are the engine. Seal the eaves and the roof gaps become ventilation, not catastrophe." Pike said nothing. He was looking at the charcoal marks on his walls, and at the candle in Marte's hand, and at the flame that was still bending toward a gap near the door frame. He was seeing his stable the way Whitcomb had seen the church, as a math problem he had been solving with the wrong numbers. She showed him how to seal the eave gaps with oiled canvas nailed flat against the framing, wide seals, wider than the gaps, the same principle Barbro had taught her for patches. She showed him how to hang a canvas partition between the stable floor and the loft to break the chimney effect. She showed him how to keep 2 small vent openings low on the north wall, controlled with sliding boards so that fresh air entered at floor level where it was coldest and did not create an upward draft. She explained each step through the candle. She held the flame near the eave gap and showed Pike how it roared sideways in the updraft. She sealed the gap with a piece of oiled cloth and held the flame again. It stilled. Pike watched the flame the way Jonas had watched it in the vestry a year earlier, with the expression of someone seeing something that had been invisible for as long as they could remember. The work took Pike and Niels Assen a day and a half. Pike paid for the canvas himself. When the horses stood in the sealed stable that evening, the stove that had failed to heat the space with unlimited wood now held the temperature steady with half the fuel. The sick horse's cough began to ease within a week. Pike did not thank Marty. He did not come to the church again, but he stopped speaking her name with the tone he had used before, and when men at Kessler's store asked him about the livery repairs, he said, "She showed me where the air was going." He said it the way he might have said the weather had changed, as a fact, not a concession, but it was enough. In a settlement where words carried weight, that single sentence undid more of Pike's year-long campaign than any apology could have. Niels Assen, who had done most of the ceiling work under Marte's direction, told Randy Moen that he had watched Pike stand in the stable after the canvas was hung and hold his hand flat in the air the way Marte had taught him, feeling for drafts, reading the room with his palm. Pike had not known he was being watched. His face, when he felt the air stay still, had shown something that Niels did not have a word for. It was not gratitude. It was not defeat. It was the expression of a man discovering that the world worked differently than he had believed, and that the discovery had come from the person he had most wanted to be wrong. Arne Vik arrived in the Salt River settlement in the spring of 1866. He was 36, a carpenter by trade, and a former army wagon repairman who had spent the last 2 years of the war keeping supply wagons moving on roads that were not roads. He had hands that knew wood the way Barbros had known canvas, by grain, by tension, by the sound a joint made when it was right or wrong. He came to the church because Reverend Whitcomb had asked him to assess the ruin's structural safety. The trustees wanted to know whether the remaining walls could support a partial roof, whether the limestone, after fire and 2 winters of freeze-thaw, was still sound enough to bear timber. Arne walked the walls with a mason's hammer, tapping stone and listening. He climbed to the wall tops on a ladder and inspected the mortar courses. He spent a full morning on the assessment before he entered the nave and looked up at the dome. He stood beneath it for a long time. He touched a rope junction. He examined a wall bracket. He followed the line of the netting with his eyes from anchor to anchor, reading the tension the way Marte had learned to read it, as a language of forces in conversation with each other. Then he turned to Marte and said, "Who designed the cradle?" "A woman named Barbro Stensland. She was a sail maker." "It is good work. The load paths are clean." He paused. "Your wall brackets will fail next winter. The mortar behind the west pair is cracked. I can reset them with new wedges and lime if you want." He did not offer to redesign the dome. He did not suggest improvements before understanding what existed. He asked before changing. Marte noticed this the way she noticed draft patterns, not as an idea, but as a physical fact about the person standing in front of her. Arne reset the brackets. He returned the next day to frame a partial roof over the vestry using salvaged timber from a collapsed barn 2 miles east. The vestry roof was not ambitious. 4 rafters, split plank decking, oiled canvas over the planks until proper shingles could be cut. But it sealed the one room in the church that had a floor and a stove and a sleeping child, and it meant that Marte no longer needed the dome to survive. The dome became what it had always been in principle, a demonstration, a proof. A teaching tool that visitors could stand inside and feel the difference between air that moved and air that stayed. Their courtship unfolded through work. Arne framed, Marte sealed. He cut joints with the precision of a man who believed that a 1/16 of an inch was the difference between a house that held and a house that leaked. She oiled the cloth that covered the joints and tested every seal with the candle before the next board went on. They argued about roof pitch. Arne favored a steep angle for snow shedding. Marte favored a moderate angle that would not create windscoop at the eaves. They compromised on a pitch that shed snow on 3 sides and presented a low profile to the northwest wind, which was the direction that had tried hardest to kill her. He built a proper stove clearance for the vestry, iron standoffs, and a stone hearth pad that kept the stove 2 inches from every combustible surface. She showed him the baffle design, and he improved it with a hinged flap that could be adjusted without removing the entire piece. He admired the design's logic. She admired his improvement's practicality. Neither said so in words. They said so by using each other's work without changing it unless asked. They did not discuss their arrangement in terms the settlement would call romantic. They discussed measurements. They discussed load-bearing. They discussed whether oak or walnut was better for a vent ring that would expand and contract with temperature changes. And somewhere inside those discussions, in the shared language of people who respected each other's competence before they respected each other's company, the arrangement became permanent in the way that well-fitted joints become permanent, not through force, but through precision. Jonas was the first to notice, or the first to act on what he noticed. He began asking Arne questions, not about the work, which he already understood from watching, but about other things. About wagon springs. About the war. About how you knew when a piece of wood was strong enough to trust. They were the questions a boy asks when he is deciding whether a man is worth knowing, and Arne answered them the way he answered questions about carpentry, carefully, specifically, without condescension, and with the understanding that a serious question deserved a serious answer regardless of who asked it. In the autumn of 1866, Arne carved a new wooden ring for the dome's vent cord, a smooth ring of black walnut shaped on a pocket lathe that replaced the frayed rope loop Marte had been using since December. It was a small thing, a functional thing, a thing that said without saying that he intended to be present for the winters that followed. Marte hung it on the cord and tested the pull. It moved smoothly. She did not thank him in words. She adjusted the cord's knot spacing to accommodate the ring's weight, which meant she intended it to stay. They married in the spring of 1867 in the vestry of the church where Marte had survived her first winter. Whitcomb performed the ceremony. Randy Moen stood as witness. Jonas held Barbro's sailmaker's palm in his coat pocket because Marte had told him it was the closest thing to having Barbro present. The dome hung above them during the ceremony, slack in the warm air, its patched silk catching the April light through the lancet windows. It was the strangest church and the most honest one in the county, a ruin that had become a home, that had become a school, that had become, briefly, a chapel again. The years compressed the way frontier years did, in seasons marked by labor and weather rather than by dates on a calendar. By 1868, the church ruin had a full vestry roof, a rebuilt entrance, and a reputation as the settlement's winter emergency shelter. The balloon silk, patched beyond recognition, hung in the nave as a permanent demonstration. Visitors came from neighboring townships to stand beneath it and feel the principle. Some came skeptical and left converted. Some came curious and left with the candle test burned into their memory. Marte did not charge for the lesson. She charged for the labor when she was hired to seal drafts in homes, barns, and stables across the county. And by the third year she had enough work each autumn to carry the household through winter, without worry. Arne built their house on the old church road, 200 yards from the ruin, using timber. He milled himself and joints he cut with the precision of a man who understood that a house was an argument against the air, and every gap was a concession. Marte sealed every joint with oiled cloth and flour paste before the boards were nailed, working from the inside out, the way her father had caulked hulls, stopping the passage before it began. The house was small by the standards of men who measured wealth in rooms. It was the warmest building in the township by the standards of anyone who measured wealth in fuel saved. Their second child, a daughter, was born in 1869. Marte named her Barbro. The name was not discussed. Arne understood without being told, the way he understood load paths and grain direction, as something that was simply true and did not need explanation. Jonas grew into the kind of boy the settlement needed: practical, quiet, good with his hands. He apprenticed with a stove repairman in the market town at 14 and came back at 17 knowing how to build a stove that drew properly and held its heat in the firebox instead of losing it through cracks in the iron. He combined his mother's understanding of air with his own understanding of fire, and by the time he was 20, he was building stoves that heated rooms with half the wood the old models required. Not because the stoves were better, but because he insisted on sealing the rooms before installing them. He would not set a stove in a drafty cabin. He would arrive with the stove and the candle and walk the room first, marking every leak, and he would not light the first fire until every mark had been sealed. The customers who complained about the extra work stopped complaining after their first winter. The balloon silk grew too fragile to hang. By 1870, the varnish had cracked and flaked. The thread had weakened, and the panels had been patched so many times that more of the dome was flour sacking and muslin than original silk. Marte took it down carefully, panel by panel, folding each section the way Barbaro had taught her to fold sail canvas, along the seams, not against them, so the folds would not crack the remaining coating. She cut the best sections into small, preserved squares. She gave one to each family that had learned from her: Randy's family, Clara Haugen, the farmer Greendheim, Niels Assen, who had never forgotten the storm night and who now sealed his own cabin with a competence that surprised everyone except Marte. She kept one square for herself. She hung it in the vestry window where the afternoon light came through. The silk was translucent where the varnish had worn thin, amber and scarred with needle holes, and when the stove warmed the room, the silk caught the light like something between glass and skin. Barbro Stensland's sailmaker's palm stayed on a shelf near the stove. Marte used it less as the years passed. Her own hands had developed the calluses that made the strap unnecessary for thin cloth, but she never moved it. Jonas's children, when they came, learned to leave it alone, not because they were told to, but because they sensed it held a weight that was not physical. Within 3 winters of the first storm night, at least a dozen households around the Salt River settlement had copied some part of Marte's principle, not the dome. That was never the lesson. Randy's children slept under a muslin canopy their mother resewed each autumn. Whitcomb kept a candle in the church chest to test drafts before sheltering travelers. Grindheim's stock barn used a canvas partition between stalls and hayloft, and his animals wintered without the coughs that had cost him 2 calves the year before. Clara Haugen taught her students the candle test as part of the winter curriculum. The knowledge traveled the way useful knowledge traveled on the frontier, in the hands of people who moved, in the memories of travelers who sheltered one night and carried the lesson home. Marte lived out her later years on the church road, known less as an inventor than as the woman people sent for when a room would not hold heat. She kept Barbro Stensland's sailmaker's palm on the shelf near the stove, and her father's old habit of watching candle flames near walls. In later age, during a mild December snow, she sat in the vestry with the stove glowing low and held the last silk square to the lamplight. It was translucent as onion skin, scarred with needle holes from a winter when every stitch had been an argument against the air. She could still smell faint oil when the room warmed. She pressed the fabric between her palms the way Barbaro had pressed it on the first day, testing, remembering, reading something in the cloth that no one else would ever feel. Outside the vestry, the limestone walls of the nave rose open to the sky the way they always had, the roof never fully rebuilt because the settlement had decided the open nave was the best way to remember what had happened there. Sleet ticked against the stone. Snow settled where pew scars had once been burned into the floor. Warren Pike had said, standing in this nave with 20 pounds of flour as his measure of a woman's life, "You cannot eat silk. You cannot burn it long enough to matter." But the silk had never been the fuel. The silk had been the room. and inside that room a child had slept while snow fell into the nave and did not touch the bed, and a man who came to take him away had been carried inside instead, and a reverend had removed his hat, and a woman who had started with $9.60, and a stove too small for the sky had answered the only question the winter had asked. The winter had asked for 6 cords of wood, but Marte Brecca had answered with a room small enough to keep its breath.